Well, I was wrong now, wasn't I? Hi everyone and welcome to Shah Lusso, and yes, today we are talking about the Tudor Black Bay Pro. Now of course, I need to address the fact that when I spoke about this watch when it was first released, I may or may not have criticized it for looking way too much like an old Explorer. We have evidence that Rolex has finally lent Tudor their photocopier. However, like in most things, you kind of have to eat your words when you're talking about it through just pictures versus actually seeing it in real life. And it's thanks to today's sponsor chronext that I was actually able to get my hands on one of these. So make sure you check the links in the description below, and if you find a watch that you'd like to buy from chronext, you can even get a discount by using the promo code that I've also listed in the description. But so, now that I got my hands on one, what is it like to actually have it in person? So first off, it is 39 millimeters in diameter by 14.2 millimeters thick. And that's one of the first things that, looking at it on paper, I thought, okay, this is probably going to be an issue because it's going to feel very thick. You get a similar sort of thickness on the Black Bay GMT. The difference is that being a little bit bigger, proportionately it all makes a bit of sense. And as someone who used to own a Tudor, specifically my Black Bay Chrono, I know that those do have a bit of a tendency to feel like sort of a hockey puck on the wrist. Thankfully though, I can say that it is actually quite comfortable on the wrist. You don't notice that thickness anywhere near as much as you would imagine when you look at it on paper. And also it doesn't wobble around as much when you have it on the bracelet. Beyond that, it has 200 meters water resistance, it has a fixed bezel instead of a rotating bezel, and it has Tudor's standard rivet bracelet, which they put on pretty much all of their Black Bay models. What does set it apart in terms of the bracelet though is of course that amazing T-fit clasp. This is Tudor's take on glide lock essentially. I actually prefer this to glide lock, partly because it seems to not really need as big a clasp as something like a glide lock equipped Rolex, and also because it's just very easy to engage. In general, I find glide locks to be quite stubborn, whereas this is much easier in terms of actually lifting it up and adjusting it to how you want it to. And speaking of its differences to Rolex, let's talk about the fact that I compared this saying that this was pretty much a photocopy of an Explorer II. I have to be honest, when you look at the pictures, it does look like that. However, this is watches. These are tiny things that the little details make all the difference. So let's start with those proportions. Like I said before, 39 millimeters in diameter, 14.2 in height. Whereas you have the current Explorer II is 42 millimeters in diameter and it's only 12.5 millimeters in height. That on its own makes for a completely different wearing experience in terms of how it feels on the wrist. Without a doubt, the Tudor feels much more, I guess, utilitarian. It is a little bit heavier, whereas something like an Explorer II, it's much more sleek. And it's fitting with Rolex's more luxury positioning. At the end of the day, they are positioned to be much more luxury watches versus Tudor, which is being positioned much more as sort of tool watches. Also, something that pictures don't really do justice is of course the difference in terms of the shades of yellow in the case of the GMT hand on the Black Bay Pro versus the orange on the Explorer II. That's something that makes itself just that little bit more apparent in person. But also there's other details that I think really set apart the Black Bay Pro and in my view actually make it much more desirable than Explorer II. For one thing, you have that nice 3D effect from the indices. They're all made out of some sort of hybrid of luminescence and ceramic, and they're all actually 3D. They're not just printed and they're not outlined by any sort of metal. This gives them a really interesting effect and makes for much more depth when you're looking at the dial. And especially considering how thick this watch is, adding a bit more visual depth within the dial, it just makes it not seem as thick because it feels like more of that thickness is going into the watch versus just adding to the exterior. And then of course you have that T-fit clasp like I mentioned before. It's really, really easy to adjust, and I think this is something that should roll out on all Tudor watches, and as usual Tudor setting the benchmark in terms of showing that this is really what every watch should have. And one last differentiator between the Black Bay Pro and the Explorer is just in terms of the shape of the case. Of course, being a Black Bay derived design, it has much sleeker lugs instead of that boxy profile of the lugs that you see on the super cased Explorer II. And I think that just makes it a little bit more elegant, and of course it evokes much more of that vintage vibe. But that being said, this is still a Black Bay at the end of the day. Still got 200 meters water resist, it still is quite slab-sided. Yes, that thickness might bother some people if you're trying to mount a cuff over it, but at the end of the day, that is the Tudor look and feel. Pretty much every Black Bay, with the exception of the 58 and the new Pelagos 39, They're all quite thick in general, but it works with their proportions. And this is one where I was concerned that the thickness wouldn't work with these 39mm proportions, but it looks perfectly fine on the wrist. You don't really notice it. And of course, a lot of that thickness is derived from its in-house movement. It uses the same one that's found in the Black Bay GMT. So you're talking 70-hour power reserve, a silicone hairspring, a true GMT movement. Now, interacting with this movement compared to an older Black Bay GMT that I tried out, I did feel like it was a little bit easier to set this movement. That could be down to the fact that this is a newer watch. Perhaps the one that I was trying out was maybe an older version or an older variant. This is a movement that has had a lot of updates since its initial release in the Black Bay GMT back in 2018. At that time, it had a few issues. So now it's definitely something that's much more sophisticated and very easy to use. And of course, it carries the most Tudor Black Bay trait of all, which is its insane value for money. With a retail price of 3,700 euros and a pre-owned value of around 3,800 up to about 5,500, not only are you retaining your money if you actually get this, you won't lose very much, but more than anything, even at retail, really what else can compete? What other good true GMT can you find that has still 70 hours power reserve, the silicone hairspring, the amazing build quality, the clasp? It all comes together in one complete package with very, very little competition at this price point. And as usual, it provides a little bit of a wake-up call for some of the other brands that are still leaning on an ETA 2893 instead of updating to true GMTs and having their own in-house GMT movements. So overall, a really, really great watch, and a watch that, in my view at least, typifies why you can't always judge a watch just by the pictures, just by what you see. You really need to try it out. In my view, this does definitely fall into the same category as things like the Lange Odysseus, the Audemars Piguet 1159, watches that in pictures just don't look anywhere near as good as they do in the metal. And in the case of this, where it looked a little bit too much like something else, when the reality is once you have it in hand, it's a completely different experience to an Explorer II. And that's before you even consider the baggage that comes with the Rolex brand on its own. So definitely a watch I would recommend, but let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the Black Bay Pro? Now, having a bit more context as to what it's like in the metal, do you think it's still too close to an Explorer? Or do you think that Tudor has done enough of an effort to separate it from its related Rolex cousin? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And again, another big thanks to Chronext for lending in both this Tudor Black Bay Pro as well as the Black Bay GMT that I've shown throughout this video. Make sure you check out the links in the description below and use the promo code if you want to get a discount on your next watch purchase. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures and infographics of watches as seen throughout this and all of my other videos, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Lusso. If you want to see more videos of watches, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification so you know when the next video comes up. And of course, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.